This is the second year that CreditorWatch has published its end of financial year playbook. It's an opportunity to look at the year that was and also an opportunity to look at what's coming up, drawing on CreditorWatch's own data as well as the insights from some of Australia's most respected financial commentators. I'm joined by Patrick Coghlan, CEO of CreditorWatch. Welcome, Patrick.
Thanks for having me, Ali. Good to be here again.
Now, Patrick, you're going to take us through some of the highlights from this year's report. So how's the economy tracking?
Look, I think the best way I've described how the economy is tracking at the moment is we probably find ourselves in a best case scenario that didn't actually exist in an economist's best case scenario, if that makes sense. We are flying, we are well ahead of anywhere that anyone expected us to be. So it is extremely positive, and we're so fortunate to be in this position.
Looking at CreditorWatch's own data, what does that tell us about trade credit at the moment?
Look, it's kind of an upside down world in COVID. You know, we've been through, call it, 15, 16 months of topsy-turvy, of peaks and troughs, et cetera, and the data's fairly up and down as well. You know, you would expect in the middle of a pandemic, a technical recession that we went through, that we would see, an increase, whether it's a tsunami or the zombie apocalypse that everyone spoke about. There should have been an increase in administrations. That's the number one thing that people expected. It's the number one question I've been asked, and it simply hasn't occurred. So I think from a trade credit perspective, administrations are still at sort of all-time lows, well down sort of 40% on pre-COVID numbers. Court actions as well are well down, and also payment defaults. And they're the sort of three leading indicators of, oncoming delinquency, and they're simply not there at the moment.
So would you see a lift at some point in the future, or are you expecting those numbers to stay relatively low?
Look, I think what we will see now is a sustained increase in those numbers over the next probably 12 to 18 months. The fact is, we're still very much operating in what I would call a synthetic environment with so much, liquidity pumped into the market from government. We're also, waiting to see what will the banks and the ATO do from a collections perspective. They are ultimately responsible for a huge number of, court actions and ultimately administrations. And to date, they're almost still at zero, despite saying that their collection actions are back in rhythm. The real sort of drastic actions certainly have not taken place yet.
So it might be a slow slide north in the future, but nothing to really shock the system.
That's right. We're not going to see this huge increase in insolvencies overnight. We're starting to see, week on week increases, but they're small at this stage. The same goes for payment defaults and court actions as well. There's nothing to suggest on the horizon that we will see this, tsunami of insolvencies take place, which is a good thing. I think, we came through COVID, obviously still in it, but, the dark days of COVID where everyone was expecting that to happen. It's now really important that we maintain that confidence. And while lockdowns come and go, Aussie businesses are much better prepared for them. They're very resilient, and maintaining that consumer and commercial confidence is extremely important. So I think everyone out there, particularly creditors, those larger ones like the ATO and the banks, are very conscious of that.
If you look at different industries, are there winners and losers, and what are they?
Yeah, look, you can look at individual industries and find winners and losers within an individual industry. You look at retail and those that had a sophisticated e-commerce offering are obviously flying. Those that could deploy an e-commerce offering are doing really well, whereas those that are still reliant on bricks and mortar retail, foot traffic in the CBD have been absolutely hammered. So that's really tough. There's, of course, you then look at accommodation, food services, hospitality. You've got some huge winners there, with everyone forced to stay within the borders, and domestic tourism hotspots have popped up all over the country. Of course, Byron Bay being the number one on everyone's list. But then you have others that, up in Cairns and Port Douglas that rely almost extensively on international tourism, and it just isn't there, and they're really struggling. At the opposite end of the spectrum, you're looking at cafes and restaurants in the CBD doing extremely tough. Obviously, it's been really good, and then the little lockdown comes along in New South Wales or Victoria, and they get hammered. But it's nice to see suburban cafes and restaurants absolutely pumping, and they still are, which is nice to see. Construction, of course, is performed really well. No real, lockdowns or restrictions on them throughout COVID, but we have seen payment times sort of blow out a touch in that space. The other one that I really wanted to talk about was health. Through COVID, we saw the healthcare sector become quite a high risk industry to deal with. And the fact was, and people go, well, how does that work in the middle of a pandemic? The things like elective surgeries were, essentially switched off for months and months. So unless you were COVID health specific, everything else was really put on hold. People weren't traveling as much, weren't moving around, weren't getting into car accidents and whatnot. And we actually saw a decrease, I'm pretty sure, in the number of deaths, for example, that took place in Australia. So the healthcare sector was actually put under quite a lot of pressure, but that certainly is coming back, and we're seeing most industries start to come back in a really healthy way.
So, Patrick, what are you seeing in terms of payment times now?
So look, payment times has been a really interesting one to follow since COVID broke, and to be honest, it's interesting pre-COVID as well. But you would really get a sense of which industries were doing it tough and which ones were doing well. Now, having a look at an industry or a company's payment patterns, the way they pay their invoices, that's usually the leading indicator of delinquency. Once they slow down their payments, that's the first stage of a debtor's journey to administration, is how we describe it. Because what you then see is they likely slow their payments. They then have a default registered against them by small and large creditors, leads to a court action, and ultimately they start defaulting with the banks and are quickly wound up thereafter. And what we've seen is a number of industries blow out and then come good. Most of them in the early days, everyone just stopped paying bills in Australia. It didn't matter if you were a big business or a small business, and we saw numbers blow out. Extensively, everyone just wanted to hoard cash, understandably. And that came off very quickly once JobKeeper and safe harbour insolvency legislation came into play. What we're now starting to see off the back of that is most industries are back to normal sort of payment times, but we've noticed a big change in small business versus large business. So how are large businesses being paid versus how smaller businesses are being paid? And what that's telling us is that larger businesses, which is largely rung true forever, but they're starting to certainly recover quicker, is that they're getting paid much faster than smaller businesses. They've got the technology, the collection teams, the know-how to do it, whereas small businesses are sort of slightly being left behind and are struggling to get their invoices paid. So we'll start to have some really interesting insights into not just industry-specific payment times, but also starting to look at how large business versus small business are paid. So that's certainly something to keep an eye on.
If you look at the financial year ahead, what would be the three things that you think will drive our economic health?
Look, the number one is clarity on the borders opening up, both remaining open from a state-based perspective, but also internationally. I think any business owner, business manager out there has a North Star that they're aiming for, an ultimate KPI, a big, hairy, audacious goal, whatever you want to call it. They have something that they're aiming for. And business owners, even if they're not overly reliant on, international travel or even interstate travel, are going, I need that clarity. What do we have to get to in order to know that I can invest in staff, in technology, in expansion? I can get back to business as usual. They need to know when those borders open. So I think that's the number one, clarity on, essentially the rollout of the vaccination program, which leads to, borders staying open and opening up. think number two is confidence that I spoke about. We were shook in those early days. They were talking about 10% of the population potentially dying. I think it was the Treasury came out and said, there's 240,000 businesses expected to go into administration if they removed JobKeeper. Just catastrophic numbers anywhere you looked at it. The banks all under a huge amount of pressure. So the fact that we've done so well, we find ourselves in this position is extremely positive, and that confidence again gives business owners, managers, etc., the confidence to hire and invest, and that needs to be maintained. So I think everyone's on board with that. No one's going to rock the ship. There's no reason to do that, and there's no benefit to do that either. So confidence is the second one, and I think the third one is that there's no longer term outbreaks of COVID. A 2-week lockdown, 3-week lockdown, we can handle that. If we had to go back to the dark days of, the Victorian lockdown of 120 odd days or whatever it was, that's really detrimental. That's catastrophic. Mm-hmm. So they're my three. I know they're quite big ones. We could get really granular if we wanted, but I'll stay high level.
Can you see a time in the future where things will be back to normal?
Look, I've got friends in London, friends in New York, and if you ask them, they would say everything has always been normal in Australia. Of course, they're starting to see the benefits of an extensive vaccination rollout, and they can start travelling and going to events now. I would argue that if you look at the numbers, whether you're looking at the ASX, lending numbers, unemployment, etc., we're almost back to normal, and there's an argument to say this is the new normal, but we're also growing as well. So it's a tough one to answer. I don't have a date in mind. I've always sort of thought, June, July next year, everything would be, I remember when we went through COVID, that old thing. But hopefully, it's a little bit earlier in the year next year.
Thanks for joining me today, Patrick. If people want more information, where should they go?
Great. Thank you, Ali. Yes, you can head to CreditorWatch.com.au, where you'll get access to the end of financial year playbook. And also you could register for the webinar that we'll have coming up very soon.